Imagine this. The ground beneath one of Christianity's holiest shrines hides the imprint of an ancient garden. And imagine that the world wrongly believed the opposite for centuries. For more than 1,000 years, religious authorities and archaeologists accepted that the hill known as Golgotha was barren rock. Nothing grew there, but new soil samples show olive tree pits and grapevine seeds directly beneath the chapel floor. If these findings hold, they shatter a foundational element of the faith site narrative, and they raise the question, what else have we been told to accept without proof? Here's the question you must stay with. Who suppressed this evidence? And why did they want you to believe a lie? Stay with me. The truth is buried deep. I arrived in Jerusalem on a cold morning in March. The streets were quiet. The sun was just rising over the old city walls. I walked through narrow stone passages toward the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is one of Christianity's most sacred places, but I wasn't there to pray. I was there to uncover a secret that had been hidden for generations beneath the ancient floor. The church stands on what believers call Golgotha. This is the hill where Jesus was crucified. For more than 1,600 years, pilgrims have visited this spot. They come from every corner of the world. They touch the stone. They weep. They believe they stand on barren rock where the cross once stood. But what if that belief is wrong? I stepped inside the church. The floor was covered in marble slabs from the Crusader era, beautiful and old. These slabs have been walked on by millions of feet over centuries. But beneath them lie layers of history no one has seen. The traditional narrative is simple. Golgotha was a rocky hill outside the city walls. Nothing grew there. The ground was bare stone. This is what we've been taught. But archival maps show something different. The area was once outside the city walls. That much is true. Therefore, the location could have been something other than bare rock. The church is managed by 3 communities. The Orthodox, Catholic, and Armenian groups share the space. But decades of dispute over access and restoration have meant little archaeological transparency. Each group guards its territory. They fight over inches of floor space. They fight over who can clean which steps. Therefore, when major work needs to be done, it takes years of negotiation. In 2022, something changed. A major restoration project began to replace the damaged floor in the northern aisle. Heavy foot traffic had worn down the stones. The communities agreed to allow the work, but this meant opening access for archaeologists. Finally, the ground could be examined, but some documents show that earlier excavation reports were withheld or locked away in church archives. Why would anyone hide old excavation reports? What were they afraid people would find? The stakes became clear to me quickly. If the accepted narrative is wrong, many things could be impacted. Pilgrimage tourism brings millions of dollars to Jerusalem each year. Institutional authority rests on the traditional story. Even theological framing might need to change. Therefore, the incentive for cover-up becomes visible. I met Professor Francesca Romana Stasola in a small office near the dig site. She led the archaeological team during the restoration. Her hands were dusty from work. Her eyes were tired but sharp. She told me something that changed everything. When we scraped the floor in Zone 4, we found olive pits in situ, she said. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the excitement beneath. That changed everything. Olive pits in situ means they were found exactly where they were originally placed thousands of years ago. Not moved, not disturbed, just there, waiting. But olive trees need soil to grow. They need gardens. They need cultivation. Therefore, if olive pits are found beneath the church floor, the site cannot have been barren rock. I looked at her. What does this mean? She smiled slightly. It means we have to rethink everything we thought we knew about this place. But before we can understand what they found, we must dig into the backstory. We must understand how this site was handled for centuries. We must understand why the truth was buried. And we must understand who benefited from keeping it hidden. A tiny speck of an ancient grapeseed will turn centuries of belief upside down. But first, we need to know where this all began. The story begins long before Jesus, long before Christianity, long before the church was built. Golgotha started as an Iron Age quarry. Workers cut stone from the hill for buildings in ancient Jerusalem. They carved deep into the rock. They left behind a scarred landscape. But then the quarry was abandoned. The area became part of the city's outskirts. By the time of Jesus, it was outside the city walls. The Romans called Jerusalem by a different name then, Aelia Capitolina. Therefore, the location was already old and layered with history when Constantine arrived. In the 4th century, Emperor Constantine's mother, Helena, came to Jerusalem. She wanted to find the holy sites of Christianity. She identified this spot as Golgotha. Constantine ordered a massive church to be built over it, but layers of construction have obscured the original landscape. Each generation built on top of the last. Stone covered stone. History buried history. Therefore, what the ground looked like in the time of Jesus became impossible to see. I met with Father Samuel, one of the church custodians. He's an old man now. He's spent 40 years in the church. He knows every stone, every crack, every story. We preserve what was given to us, he told me. The traditions passed down through centuries. But I asked him about the excavations, about the reports from the 19th century, about what earlier archaeologists found. He grew quiet. Those were different times, he said. Not everything was recorded properly. Therefore, conflicting agendas meant reports were fragmentary. Pilgrimage needed certainty. Science needed questions. The two couldn't exist together peacefully. But there was something else. Something in the ancient texts that no one could explain away. The Gospel of John mentions a garden at the crucifixion site. It says clearly, in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, not barren rock, not a quarry, a garden with plants and soil and life. But traditional archaeology never found garden evidence. No seeds, no pollen, no traces of cultivation. Therefore, the idea was dismissed as symbolic, metaphorical, not literal. The archaeologists assumed John was speaking poetically. Gardens meant paradise. Gardens meant beauty and life after death. It couldn't have been a real garden. But what if they were wrong? In 2023, preliminary botanists found something. They were examining soil samples from beneath the floor, just routine analysis. But they found pollen, olive pollen and grape pollen in the archaeological strata. The team was shocked. Pollen survives for thousands of years in the right conditions. And this pollen was exactly where it shouldn't be, right beneath the church floor, right at the level dating to 2,000 years ago. But the team was told to keep findings quiet until analysis was complete. No announcements, no press, no public statements. Why? I dug deeper. I spent weeks in archives, dusty files in old cabinets, documents no one had looked at for decades. And then I found it. A key file from 1960s excavation, buried in a box marked miscellaneous. The file mentioned vineyard terrain beneath the northern aisle. Vineyard terrain. That means grapevines grew there. That means cultivation. That means soil and care and human hands tending plants. But this file was never published, never shared, never discussed. Therefore, suspicion of deliberate suppression arises. I confronted Father Samuel with the file. I showed him the pages, the faded ink, the careful drawings of the excavation layers. Why wasn't this shared? I asked. He looked at the papers for a long time. His hands shook slightly. Some things complicate the narrative, he finally said. Some things raise more questions than answers. But isn't that the point? I pressed. Shouldn't we ask questions? He didn't answer. And then we discovered a sealed report from 1971 that was never published. It sat in a Vatican archive for 50 years. No one mentioned it. No one referenced it. It was as if it didn't exist, but it did exist, and I had it in my hands. The door to the hidden evidence was cracked open. Now the confrontation would begin. The research team worked quickly. Time was short. They sent samples to Rome for analysis. The best archaeobotanists in Europe would examine them. Microscopes, carbon dating, chemical tests. Every method available, but the lab results shocked everyone. Grape seeds and olive pits in the bedrock fill. Not just traces, not just pollen, actual seeds, actual pits, physical remains of plants. These results contradicted the rocky hill narrative of Golgotha. For centuries, everyone believed the site was bare stone, but here was proof. Plants grew there, gardens existed there. Therefore, either the traditional story was wrong or the samples were contaminated somehow. The team triple-checked everything. They ran the tests again. Same results. They brought in outside experts. Same conclusion. The evidence was solid. But then I uncovered something else. Correspondence between church authorities and the State Antiquities Board. Emails, letters, official requests. They were asking for restrictions on publication. They wanted control over what information could be released. They wanted approval over any press statements. Therefore, the possibility of active suppression emerged. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't oversight. This was deliberate. I confronted Dr. Rachel Cohen, a member of the Antiquities Board. She met me in a cafe near the Old City. She looked nervous. "Why the restrictions?" I asked. She stirred her coffee slowly. "These sites are sensitive," she said. "Religious feelings must be considered." "But what about truth? Truth is complicated," she replied. But there was more pressure. A tick clock situation. The restoration floor had to be completed before the next Easter pilgrimage season. Millions of pilgrims would arrive. The church had to be ready. The floors had to be finished. Therefore, the excavation zones had to be closed quickly. This reduced opportunity for full disclosure. Rush the work, seal the ground, move on. The team fought back. They announced publicly at a small press conference in November 2023. Professor Stasola stood at a podium. She held up photos of the samples. "We found cultivation beneath the church floor dating to 2,000 years ago," she said. Her voice was steady, clear, certain, but media coverage was muted. A few articles in archaeology journals, a brief mention in religious news. Nothing major, nothing that would reach ordinary people. And academic commentary raised doubts. Some scholars questioned the dating methods. Others suggested the samples might have been deposited later, maybe during medieval times, maybe during Crusader construction. The pushback was fierce. A senior cleric, Cardinal Benedetti, issued a statement. I obtained a copy. It warned that the narrative may destabilize faith tourism and pilgrim tradition. It suggested the archaeologists should tone down their findings, show more sensitivity, consider the faithful. Therefore, the archaeologists faced pressure from multiple sides. The church wanted silence, the Antiquities Board wanted control, and some academics wanted to protect their own long-held positions. Professor Stasola called me late one night. She sounded exhausted. "When we found the olive pits, I thought, this means the hill was once planted," she said. "That breaks the textbook version, but no one wants to hear it." "Why not?" I asked. "Because it changes too much. People have invested their whole careers in the old story. Pilgrims have invested their faith. Changing the narrative means admitting we were wrong for centuries." I understood then. This wasn't about archaeology anymore. This wasn't about seeds and soil. This was about power, about who controls the story, about who decides what people believe. The tension shifted from academic to institutional to personal. Professor Stasola received threatening emails. Nothing violent, but unsettling. Messages telling her to stop, to be quiet, to respect tradition. But she refused. "Science doesn't care about tradition," she told me. "Evidence is evidence." The pattern broke. I switched from interviewing archaeologists to examining church archives to walking the streets of Jerusalem at night. The story was unfolding in real time. Pieces were coming together, but the biggest pieces were still hidden. The evidence was multiplying. More samples, more tests, more confirmation, and the stakes were diving to crisis level. Something had to break. Someone had to give. The confrontation was becoming personal, and it was far from over. Multiple storylines collided in December 2023. The archaeological team continued their work in secret. The church custodians held emergency meetings behind closed doors. The Antiquities Authority issued vague statements about ongoing research, but no one was transparent about earlier reports from the 1960s and 1970s. Those decades were a blank space, a gap in the record. No one wanted to talk about what happened back then. Therefore, I decided to dig into the archives myself. I spent days in the basement of the École Biblique, a French archaeological institute in Jerusalem. Boxes and boxes of old files, handwritten notes, black and white photographs, field reports covered in dust. And then I found it, a 1971 field note. The paper was yellow and brittle. The handwriting was cramped and faded, but the words were clear. Vineyard wall adjacent to rock-cut tomb. Vineyard wall. That means a constructed wall, built to support grapevines, built by farmers, built in an ancient garden. Therefore, the earlier assumption of barren rock was already challenged decades ago. The evidence existed 50 years ago, but someone chose not to share it. Someone chose to bury it. I photographed the note. I made copies. I needed proof. But when I asked the institute director about it, he grew defensive. That note is out of context, he said. We don't know who wrote it or what they were referring to. It has a date and a grid reference, I countered. It clearly refers to the church site. He refused to discuss it further. The journalist in me smelled a cover-up, so I pushed harder. I contacted retired archaeologists who had worked on early excavations. Most wouldn't talk, but one agreed to meet me. Professor David Myers was 92 years old. He lived in a small apartment in Tel Aviv. His walls were covered with photographs from dig sites. His mind was sharp. I was there in 1971, he said. We found things that didn't fit the narrative. Like what? Like evidence of cultivation, like garden walls, like irrigation channels. He paused. But we were told to focus on the Roman and Byzantine layers. The garden evidence was considered less important. Why? Because it complicated things. The church wanted a clear story. Rock, crucifixion, resurrection. Simple. Adding gardens made it messy. But then something broke the story wide open. A leaked document appeared in my email. Anonymous sender. No return address, just a PDF attachment. It was an internal memo from 1975, written by the head of the Antiquities Authority to the church patriarchs. The memo acknowledged olive and grape traces found during excavation, but it recommended the findings be stored and not published. The reason given: to avoid unnecessary confusion among the faithful and to maintain site integrity. Therefore, the cover-up began to unravel publicly. I published the memo online. Within hours, it went viral in archaeological circles. Media outlets picked it up. Suddenly, everyone was asking questions. The church issued a statement denying any cover-up. Different archaeological standards existed in the past, the statement read. What was considered significant has changed over time, but the damage was done. The looming crisis was clear. If the discovery stood, pilgrimage maps would need updating. Theological guides would need revision. Historical textbooks would need correction. The custodians feared backlash and loss of control. For centuries, they had been the guardians of sacred knowledge. Now scientists were questioning their authority. Father Samuel called me. He was angry. You're destroying something sacred, he said. People's faith depends on the traditional story. But what if the traditional story is incomplete? I asked. Incomplete is different from wrong. Is it? He hung up. That night, I received another anonymous email. This one contained scanned slides from a 1972 excavation. The images showed botanical samples in situ, clear photographs of grape seeds, clear photographs of olive pits, dated and labelled. These slides had been hidden for half a century, and the reaction was immediate. Archaeological forums exploded with debate. Church officials issued contradictory statements. The Antiquities Board promised an investigation. Tonight, we reveal the slide that was hidden for half a century, and the reaction will shock you. But first, we need to understand what happened next, because with all parties in motion, the final confrontation was about to begin. January 2024 brought the highest tension yet. The archaeologists prepared their full data set: pollen samples, olive seeds, grapevine seeds, soil analysis, radiocarbon dating in progress. Everything documented, everything verified, everything ready for peer review. But the church custodians publicly raised concerns about disrupting pilgrim faith. They held a press conference. Multiple cardinals and bishops stood together. They presented a united front. We respect science, Cardinal Benedetti said, but we also respect 2,000 years of Christian tradition. We ask for caution in how these findings are presented. Translation: please stop. But the researchers argued truth must prevail over tradition. Professor Stasola responded at her own press conference the next day. We're not attacking faith, she said. We're revealing history. If the Gospel of John says there was a garden, and we found evidence of a garden, that should strengthen faith, not threaten it. Brilliant argument, using scripture against the institution. But then came the major reversal, a bombshell that changed everything. Dr. Abraham Levi, a senior official with the Antiquities Authority, retired suddenly in February, and then he gave an interview, an explosive interview that made headlines worldwide. He revealed that they shelved the initial 1960s and 1970s slides because they didn't fit the accepted narrative. He said it plainly, no euphemisms, no diplomatic language. We were told to prioritize findings that supported the traditional understanding of the site, he said. Garden evidence was considered problematic, so it was set aside. Who told you to do this? The interviewer asked. It came from the top, church leadership and government officials. They didn't want controversy. Therefore, the notion of innocent omission turned into intentional suppression. This wasn't bureaucratic oversight. This wasn't lost files. This was a deliberate decision to hide truth. The emotional stakes exploded. Local pilgrim communities organized protests. Hundreds gathered outside the church. They held signs, "Respect our faith," and "Science versus pace." Isaiah's use tradition. They felt attacked. They felt their beliefs were being dismantled. Years of prayer and pilgrimage suddenly seemed based on incomplete information. But the researcher team stood firm. At a community meeting, Professor Stasola addressed the pilgrims directly. "Finding a garden doesn't diminish your faith," she said. "It enriches it. The gospel was right. John wrote about a garden because there was a garden. We're proving the text, not disproving it." Some listened, some didn't. The division was deep. All storylines converged at the church site in March. Research team, institutional custodians, pilgrims, media, everyone showed up, cameras everywhere, tension thick enough to cut. Chaos built, arguments broke out between pilgrims and archaeologists. Accusations flew. Church guards tried to maintain order. The Antiquities Board issued statements, then retracted them, then issued new ones. Resolution seemed possible only through confrontation. Someone had to yield. Something had to give. I witnessed a nighttime excavation in late March. The team was finishing their last tests before the floor had to be permanently sealed. Floodlights illuminated the dig site. Shadows danced on ancient stones. I saw them carefully extract a final sample, a perfectly preserved olive pit. Professor Stasola held it up to the light. Her eyes were wet with tears. "This is it," she whispered. "This is proof." Flash of lost slides projected on a wall. Documents spread across tables. Angry phone calls echoing through corridors. Press statements drafted and redrafted. The machinery of institutional crisis in full motion. And then the question everyone was asking. The question that defined everything. Will the data hold up in the court of public opinion? The scientific community said yes. The evidence was solid. Multiple independent labs confirmed the findings. Radiocarbon dating placed the samples firmly in the 1st century. But public opinion is not about data. It's about belief, about tradition, about what people want to be true. The stage was set. All the pieces were in place. The evidence was overwhelming. The suppression was exposed. The conflict was at its peak. This was the moment of truth, the moment when everything would change, the moment when centuries of accepted belief would collide with archaeological reality. What happened next would determine not just how we understand this site, but how we understand the relationship between faith and truth. April 15, 2024. The date everything changed. The team released their full peer-reviewed report, published in the Journal of Archaeological Science. 93 pages of data, analysis, photographs, and conclusions. The title, Botanical Evidence for Cultivation at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Reassessing the Golgotha Landscape. The findings were undeniable. Olive tree pits and grapevine seeds beneath the church floor. Radiocarbon dated to approximately 2,000 years ago, precisely aligning with the timeline of the crucifixion. Therefore, the core mystery was resolved. Golgotha was not barren rock. It was a garden, an actual, living, cultivated garden. The holy ship moment, right there, in peer-reviewed print. Undeniable, irrefutable, true. The previously accepted narrative of a barren rock hill outside the city was invalidated. Every textbook, every tour guide, Every theological commentary, every sermon preached about the barren hill of death, all of it needed revision. Therefore, the pilgrimage map and church narrative had to change. Within hours, the report was downloaded thousands of times. News outlets around the world ran the story. Ancient garden found beneath holy site. Biblical text confirmed by science. 2,000-year cover-up exposed. The resolution of the central conflict came not through compromise, but through evidence. The data won, truth won, but the emotional impact was profound. I returned to Jerusalem to witness the response. I walked through the church with Sister Maria, a nun who had been a pilgrim guide for 30 years. She was crying, not from anger, from something else. "I've told people for 3 decades that this was bare rock," she said. "I believed it. I taught it. And now I learn there was a garden all along. How does that make you feel?" Amazed, humbled, like I've been seeing only part of the picture. The team arranged a special viewing. They opened the newly reconstructed garden layer beneath the floor, a glass panel installed so visitors could look down. You could see the ancient soil, the stratification layers, the place where the olive pits were found. Professor Stasola met a pilgrim there, an elderly man named Thomas, who had visited every year for 4 decades. They stood together, looking down at the garden layer beneath their feet. "I came here my whole life believing one thing," Thomas said quietly. "Now I see something I never imagined." "Does it change your faith?" Professor Stasola asked gently. "It deepens it. John was right. There was a garden. The gospel told the truth. Emotional catharsis, the moment where science and faith could coexist, where truth enhanced rather than destroyed belief. The payoff of foreshadowing came in waves. The lost slides from the 1970s were finally shown in a public exhibition at the Israel Museum. Visitors lined up to see them. The photographs that had been hidden for 50 years now displayed under glass. The Gardner analyst's early memo from 1971 was published in full. Vindication for Professor David Myers, who had known the truth all along. The archival note about the vineyard wall was validated. Excavation teams returned to that exact grid reference and found the wall. Still there, still standing after 2,000 years. Therefore, all threads tied together, every clue, every hint, every suppressed piece of evidence, all of it confirmed. I arranged the final confrontation. I brought Cardinal Benedetti, Father Samuel, Professor Stasola, and Dr. Levi together in one room. A mediated discussion, cameras off, just honest conversation. "Will this change how you describe the site to visitors?" I asked the church custodians. Silence, long and heavy. Finally, Father Samuel spoke. "Yes, it must. We cannot deny evidence. We cannot continue teaching what we know to be incomplete." Cardinal Benedetti nodded slowly. "The Church has always believed truth and faith are compatible. This is our chance to prove it." Therefore, the power dynamic shifted. The institution that had suppressed the evidence for decades now embraced it. Not because they wanted to, because they had to. The garden was real. The gospel was accurate. The ground beneath our feet held secrets that changed our understanding of sacred history. And in that moment, standing in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre with archaeologists and clerics and pilgrims, I felt the weight of revelation. Truth had been buried, but truth, like seeds in soil, will eventually break through to the light. The immediate aftermath rippled outward like waves from a stone dropped in water. May 2024, the Church issued a joint communiqué. All 3 custodial communities, Orthodox, Catholic, and Armenian, signed it together. This alone was historic. These groups rarely agree on anything. The statement acknowledged the new findings. It promised updated guide materials. It committed to transparency in future archaeological work. But some pilgrim groups protested the change. They organized petitions. They claimed the Church was betraying tradition. They argued that acknowledging the garden somehow diminished the crucifixion. Old beliefs die hard, even when faced with truth. Professor Francesca Romana Stasola won the prestigious Kathleen Kenyon Award for Archaeological Achievement. She gave her acceptance speech in London in June. I was there. "This discovery reminds us that the ground holds memories we've forgotten," she said. "Our job is to listen to what the earth tells us, even when it contradicts what we've always believed." Standing ovation, 5 minutes long. The custodial board initiated new transparency policies. All future excavations would be published within 1 year. All archival materials would be digitized and made available to researchers. No more hidden files, no more suppressed evidence. A small victory, but a real one. Dr. Abraham Levi published his own memoir about the suppression. Secrets Beneath Sacred Ground became a bestseller. He donated all proceeds to archaeological education programs. I want young archaeologists to know they must follow evidence, not politics, he wrote in the introduction, and I filed my final report. This documentary, this investigation, this story of truth buried and truth revealed. But the implications reach far beyond one site in Jerusalem. The discovery forces historians to re-examine other settled holy site narratives. If we were wrong about Golgotha, what else might we be wrong about? Biblical archaeology gained new energy. Funding increased. Universities launched new programs. The field had been stagnant for decades. Now it felt alive again. Museums updated their exhibits. Tourist maps changed. Guidebooks were reprinted with new information. The infrastructure of pilgrimage tourism adapted. Slowly, reluctantly, but it adapted. More profoundly, the discovery changed how we think about sacred ground. For centuries, we treated holy sites as frozen in time, fixed, unchangeable, beyond question. But this discovery proved that even the most sacred places have hidden dimensions, layers we haven't explored, stories we haven't heard. Therefore, we must approach all sacred sites with both reverence and curiosity. Faith and inquiry can coexist. The emotional reflection mattered most. I received hundreds of emails from people around the world, pilgrims, believers, skeptics, scholars, all sharing their reactions. Many felt liberated. I always wondered about that garden reference in John, one woman wrote. Now I know it was real. My faith feels stronger. Others felt betrayed. Why did they lie to us for so long? A man asked. What else aren't they telling us? Both reactions are valid. Truth is complicated. It brings relief and it brings pain. What does it mean if what you believed may have been incomplete? How do institutions handle truth when it threatens tradition? These are the questions we must sit with. There are no easy answers. I returned to Jerusalem one final time in October 2024. I walked through the old city at dawn. The stones glowed golden in early light. I entered the Church of the Holy Sepulchre alone. I stood over the glass panel showing the garden layer. I looked down at the ancient soil, the place where olive trees once grew. The place where grapevines climbed walls, the place where life flourished 2,000 years ago. The ground was hiding a garden, and now we've found it. The quote from the opening, now affirmed. The narrative loop closed, the promise delivered. They didn't want you to know this. Church authorities, government officials, institutional gatekeepers. They wanted you to accept the simple story, the barren rock, the stark hill of death. But now you've seen it. The complexity, the beauty, the truth. In the hill of Golgotha, we discovered a garden. And in that garden, we found the gate to a new history. A more complete history. A truer history. The ground beneath our feet holds secrets. Some buried for millennia. Some buried for decades. Some buried deliberately. But eventually, truth breaks through, like a seed pushing through soil toward light. That's what we learned in Jerusalem. That's what the garden taught us. Truth buried can still grow.